We're beginning the Holy Men section of The Phoenix, an illustrated review of occultism philosophy by Manly P. Hall. For centuries, the government of Asia has been a theocratic mendicancy. As medieval Europe was overridden by beggar friars, so India impoverished by its holy men, and Tibet by its lamas. Even Martin Luther was forced by his order to strap on a beggar's purse and go from door to door soliciting alms in the name of God for the richest church in the world. This impecuniosity became more or less of a profession among certain classes in Merry England. Able-bodied men with a disinclination for hard work cultivated a pious mien, and rolling their eyes heavenward, solicited funds for a legion of existent as well as non-existent ends. Begging so depleted the country's resources that Henry VIII found time amid his marital distractions to rid, with one grand gesture, the land of this nuisance. When religion approves of mendicancy, it does so on the presumption that those who are poor for the glory of God shall dwell in a state of poverty and humility, and that their lives shall be passed in fasting and prayer, and the generous doing of good deeds. In Europe, however, the professional mendicant was too often plump and comfortable, with a well-filled gullet and a wine cellar running over, smug in the attitude of safety, ensconced behind the fair name of the church. He enjoyed the best things in life, his useless existence made secure through the generosity of the industrious poor. This old man of the sea has now ceased to be a weighty equation among the Occidental people, who have cast off church and clergy together to seek God individually, each according to his own light. In Asia, the problem is still acute, for in India holy men are numbered among the millions, and their convocations, such as those held periodically at Allahabad, are attended by tens of thousands. In Tibet, it has been estimated that every fourth member of the population belongs to some religious order, which means, in the majority of cases, that he is not self-sustaining. Aside from his purely religious routine, his chief duty is to descend from the high lamaseries, which overshadow most Tibetan villages, for the purpose of collecting the religious taxes imposed upon every farmer and shopkeeper. This onus of tribute has not only impoverished Tibet, but weighs heavily upon China. Many of the Tibetan Buddhist colleges and monasteries have as many as 10,000 monks housed in their cell-like chambers. We will not say that they are extravagantly supported, for in the most cases their wants are comparatively few. In comparison with the wealth of the country, however, their maintenance is wholly unjustified. Is the indignant monk or holy man a legitimate exponent of religious principles? Or more important still, is he valuable enough to the world as a religious recluse to justify his support by society? The irreligionist will instantly imply in the negative. The ascetic is unquestionably an equation in society. The chemistry of life conspires to produce certain types who simply do not belong to the popular orders of things, but by virtue of their composition must live and dream and die apart from the masses. However, the number so destined by nature or karma is negligible in comparison with the aggregate of those who are exploiting the theory at the present time. A Brahmin pundit once told us that out of the several million holy men in India, there were probably a few hundred, or at most a very few thousand, whom, by virtue of their peculiar spiritual attainments, were justly entitled to public support. The rest were divisible into two classes. The first consisted of sincere but misguided men who felt that their religion demanded a miserable existence as indispensable to spirituality. The other class was composed of work-dodgers, beggars, and thieves. The true mystic is not a liability to the community, which in some cases must assist him in temporal matters, because his ideals and visions are, to a great degree, the basis of racial growth. Measures have been proposed, both in this country and in Europe, for state support of genius, and this unquestionably is a most commendable measure. The great artist, musician, philosopher, scientist, or aesthetician is seldom a provident man. His physical needs must be protected if the world at large is to benefit from the rare qualities of his mind. The world will never become bankrupt from its support of creative minds. Herein lies the real wealth of the world. There is a wide interval, however, between the protection of superior types and the doling out of vast sums to perpetuate chronic uselessness. Take for instance our economic depression. It is estimated that there are, at this writing, approximately 20 million wage earners out of work in Europe and America. This constitutes an international crisis, and nearly every individual fortunate enough to have steady employment feels called upon to assist the unfortunate to the limits of his means. This worthy motive has been exploited in a number of disgraceful ways. The 2 years following the Depression were the golden age of beggardom and professional vagrancy. The sympathy aroused by the pleasure of adverse circumstances ensures public generosity, and thousands were receiving assistance daily who had neither desire nor intention to improve their present state. Industrious humanity has always supported parasites, and certain classes have always gained their substance by preying upon the sympathy and generosity of honest folk. In this article we shall confine ourselves entirely to that class of holy men who, lacking that genius which would warrant their maintenance by the community, are still utterly sincere in their belief that their poverty and self-inflicted misfortunes improve their standing in the sight of God. Oriental mendicants differ from those of the Occident in their cultivation of discomfiture. Although the Christian clergy has practiced flagellation, it has never turned to the mortification of the flesh with the widespread enthusiasm found in India. The underlying theory is the same. In the West, however, there is a wider interval between the theory and the practice. Christian missionaries in India discovered that the recital of the sufferings and death of Jesus produced but little effect upon the Asiatic mind. A pious Hindu once said that the martyrdom of one Jew could scarcely be considered of cosmic import when, in India, there were hundreds of thousands of devout men torturing themselves to death, inflicting upon themselves every conceivable agony, all for the glorification of their spiritual state. The sufferings of the Nazarene, moreover, are equaled, if not surpassed, by the ingenious tortures which these holy men perpetrate upon their own bodies. If pain and suffering actually achieve salvation, then heaven should be filled with Hindus. A learned Brahmin once sadly shook his head, saying, "The wise know that the way to perfection is not through pain, but the unenlightened cannot realize this, and their reward will be measured by the sincerity of their motive. Pain is the prayer of India." Referring to the austerities practiced by Eastern holy men, Frank G. Carpenter writes, "Their methods of torture are legion. I have seen some who have sat or stood still until their bodies have stiffened and they have lost the use of their muscles and joints. Some hold their tightly clenched fists overhead until the fingernails grow into the flesh of their palms. There are yogins and bedonars who never sit down, and others who lie on beds of iron spikes or upon masses of broken stones. This is not half the story. Walking along the Ghats steps on the banks of the Ganges, one can witness in course of a day a pitiful array of mutilated humanity. The human pincushion, a holy man who has pierced his body with so many sticks that he resembles a porcupine, another whose arms are entirely withered off, leaving only bony stumps, a third who hangs downward from a specially prepared brace until he becomes unconscious from the rush of blood to his head, a fourth who has blinded himself with red-hot irons, a fifth who has walked with his head turned backwards until it has grown that way. He can take no food except a few drops of liquid at a time. One cannot but ask what these men's concept of God must be, if they imagine the all-merciful Father taking delight in such sights. Many of these holy men are performing penance in expiation for some sin. They are becoming pure by becoming useless. What a peculiar viewpoint to consider that one may become valuable to the deity by becoming useless to himself and a drag upon his world. Many Hindus worship deity in the shape of the Great Mother, but what parent could gaze without tears at her deformed children, especially if she realizes that they had deformed themselves for the love of her? The only way that such practices have been justified is the claim that they were steps to self-control, and that the mendicant achieved the firmness of will by demonstrating over the pangs of the flesh. Even this is scarcely a sufficient explanation, for the truly enlightened have found God in beauty, in service, and in consummation of high ideals. While we honor all such voluntary sufferers for the right motive which inspires their deeds, we look forward to that age when men shall worship God joyously and not miserably. Religion has few laws, and they are simple and generous. Theology has innumerable laws, cruel and complex, burdened with the weight of inhibitory statutes throughout the centuries. Men have mistaken discomfort for virtue. Consider the rulings of St. Columban, a holy man of Ireland, who ruled that any monk who did not say Amen at grace, who talked in the refectory, or who coughed at the beginning of a psalm, was to be given 6 lashes with the monastery whip. For other offenses varying from hiccoughs to forgetfulness at confession, he might be punished with lashes up to 200, which were to be administered lustily by some zealous cleric. Not long ago we heard an enthusiastic man of God bewailing the discontinuance of the practice of flagellation. He considered horsewhipping a useful method of impressing humanity with the glory of God, going so far as to imitate that the present tendency toward backsliding in religion was largely due to the discontinuance of this enlightened form of instruction. The Church, during the Middle Ages, proved that if it whipped a man long enough, he could be made to say almost anything that his tormentors desired him to. In his lives of the Fathers, Butler describes one instance of penalty piety. Peter of Alcantara, who died in 1562, in order that his eyes might be more easily kept under the government of reason, and that they might not be superfluous curiosity, break in upon the interior recollection of his mind, put them upon such a restraint that he had been a considerable time a religious man before he knew that the church of his monastery was vaulted. The truth was, he had never lifted his eyes to the ceiling. He lived 4 years in the monastery without taking notice of a tree that grew near the door. R.S. Hardy goes on to say that this same monk told St. Teresa that he had lived 3 years in a house of his order without knowing any of the friars, but by their speech, as he never lifted up his eyes. If he did not follow the other friars, he was unable to find his way to many places that he frequented. Here is a man who spent a lifetime looking at other men's heels, fearing that if he lifted his eyes to their faces, his consciousness of the glory of God would evaporate. It never occurred to him that if he would raise his face and gaze upon the world about and into the heavens above, he could behold far more advantageously the wonders of his Creator. What a strange psychology that a man should be afraid to look at life lest his God escape life. Of course, may be disillusioning, but scarcely to that degree. St. Simon Stylites was another notable example of suspended industry. After he had worn out the top of a pillar in the Liberian desert, he was finally carried to his reward, and his pedestal was immediately occupied by another enthusiast who sat there longer than St. Simon did. Even 60 feet of pillar could hardly lift St. Simon beyond contamination. So he forbade any person, with special emphasis upon those of the opposite sex, to approach within 100 feet of his isolated column. What did the good man fear? Was he afraid of others, or was he afraid of himself? Historians do not tell us, but we know that he sat there selfishly hugging divinity to himself while his disciples sent his food up to him in buckets. Such actions indicate weakness rather than strength. Most men remain in this world fighting the problems of life and retain at least a reasonable amount of virtue. But even on the top of his pillar, St. Simon had a hard time keeping his integrity intact. If he had studied Socrates, he would have realized that spirituality does not depend upon where you are, but upon what you are. This brings us to the more practical problem of the moment, the attitude of the modern student of philosophy and occultism toward the responsibilities of life. We have so long been taught the merit of evading worldliness that the spirit of the eternal mendicant is still within our bones. Nearly everyone interested in the development of his own potential powers bewails the fact that imminent responsibilities bind him to some temporal environment. There is also a survival of that pernicious belief that there is something uncomfortable about piety. Very few people approach the problem of religion with a normal viewpoint. Many come disillusioned with the whole vista of life. As a lady once said to us, "My life has been one long misfortune, and so at last, discouraged with it all, I am turning to God. The belief that deity is a sort of last refuge is a more or less pernicious belief, for it is highly improbable that those who have never been able to find themselves will somehow at once discover God. Religion is not an escape from life, and to the few whom it has such significance, it is a blasphemy. Religion is a completing of life. It is the realization of the sacredness of every aspect of being. It is the divinity in the part rising gloriously to a recognition of the divinity in the all. It is not a matter of symbols nor again of words or forms, but rather the natural instinct to venerate realized through intelligence and action. Spirituality is a realization of values, and these values cannot be established except through contact with life. The man who cannot be spiritual where he is and under the conditions now confronting him cannot be spiritual under other conditions unless he improves the quality of his own consciousness. The religion of the average person is selfishly concerned with the release of his own life from bondage to mediocrity, monotony, and effort. And even among those who know better or should know better, religion is still regarded as a justification for the evasion of temporal responsibilities. The world is filled with people seeking enlightenment, but eating the food provided for them by the unenlightened. We have a tendency to allow others to perform those labors which we feel ourselves too highly evolved to undertake, yet we accept and use the efforts of their labors as the abstract ideal of the race. Every individual must achieve to the position of self-sufficiency. In other words, he must supply himself with that which is necessary for his continuance. There is a certain compensation in nature. A philosopher who is really a philosopher has come to the realization of the impermanence of all material things. Therefore, he does not need and should not desire either wealth or position. His maintenance, therefore, is no great problem, for, satisfied with little, he stores up his treasures where there are neither bank robberies nor gang wars. But philosophers are comparatively scarce, and most people desire of heavenly riches are also desirous of accumulating as much as they can of this world's goods. Buddha permitted his disciples to practice mendicancy, but limited it to such a degree that the idea could not be exploited successfully. For example, the Buddhist monk may not ask for alms by word or sign, but may accept it if it is given to him without any solicitation on his part. If he desires to achieve to the highest state of virtue, he may accept no alms other than such as are necessary for his immediate needs. He is not permitted any form of accumulation. He may accept enough rice for his meal, but not enough for the next meal, and he must go hungry until the innate generously of some pious person supplies the next meal. In this way, begging became hard work and exploitation difficult, as the holy man was also the village physician and constantly employed in administering to the physical or metaphysical needs of the community. He earned his support. Every itinerant Buddhist monk had a daily round not to exceed 7 miles leading through villages and hamlets. He ministered to whatever needs arose in these communities, enlightening or encouraging all who were troubled or confused. He was consequently a very useful person, justifying his modest needs. Today, however, religions are large economic institutions, maintaining elaborate organizations, owning valuable real estate, and meeting heavily padded payrolls. High altars worth $500,000, vestments embroidered with 22-karat gold, a place of worship that dwarf the palaces of kings are the order of the day. All this panoply, supported by the thrift of the world, is deemed necessary to the teaching of the Golden Rule and the redemption of the human soul from its relapsed condition. In our wanderings about, we have discussed this matter with many persons, particularly those of metaphysical inclinations, especially among those who teach occultism or philosophy. There is the feeling that no worldly possession is too good to be conferred for such instruction. In other words, the public should pay well. This good old theological attitude has one erroneous concept within it. The world has been paying well for religion for at least 10,000 years, and the better it pays, the less it gets. A philosopher or spiritual teacher is not entitled to exploit the gullibility of the masses. If he gives his life to the instruction of the public, he is entitled to sufficient to meet the needs of the moment. But religion does not justify nor expediency sanction the great fortunes made by exploiting the beliefs of mankind. This does not mean that poverty is necessarily a virtue, for if economies be taken as a gauge, the highest virtue would be the intelligent application of wealth. It simply means that holy men and students of spiritual matters have no right to consider themselves as the salt of the earth, or to feel that the world treats them unjustly if it does not choose to support them in affluence. Religion and philosophical orders were primarily established to serve the spiritual needs of the race. In this late day, however, it is too often the race has served or even become enslaved to the monastery needs or extravagances of theological institutions. Since the decline of the pagan mysteries in the early centuries of the Christian era, the secret doctrine has disappeared from the temples of the Western world, and even in Asia it has become obscured almost beyond recognition by the rise of disconnected and discordant cults. Empty of their wisdom, the sanctuaries have become blind alley roads leading to nowhere, and those who devoutly walk in one of the several paths reach the end only to discover that they have been cheated of the instruction and enlightenment they have struggled so arduously to obtain. If there be one cause more responsible than another for the decay of religious institutions, it is the economic urge. Sermonizing piously upon the virtue of storing up heavenly treasure, these organizations have gladly compromised their celestial standing and sacrificed their birthright in heaven for a bowl of very material pottage. The shrines of the gods are most truly ornamented when adorned with the righteousness of the believers. No jewel is more precious than a noble life, and there is no higher altar than that of the human heart. Religion teaches this, and then put their own faith in gilt-edged securities and city bonds. With the advent of money as an equation into spiritual affairs, corrosion set in. Aesop, the great fabulist was murdered by the priests of Delphi, because they were afraid that he would expose the corruption that had crept into that institution. The vast treasure accumulated as the result of the gifts of the faithful had turned the heads of the priests until only the rich and powerful could obtain access to the sanctuary. Nothing this fact, Aesop remarked upon it, and the attendants of the oracle in their panic lest he revealed their sacrilege to the world had him put out of the way. In time Apollo deserted the oracular vent, for the gods will be no party to the perversions of men. The gods have turned from more than one faith, but invariably because, in the first place, that faith turned on them. Some short-sighted person, whose name is as well forgotten, caused unending confusion and misunderstanding by dividing the universe into a sacred and profane part. He conceived deity to prefer some parts of the world to others, and also to hold equally definite opinions as to men's labors and attitudes. Certain purists came to be viewed as more commendable than others, and those who performed these tasks gained social distinction. Thus it was more worldly to milk a sacred cow than just an ordinary cow, and there was a higher reward for sweeping steps on the temple than sweeping the steps of your own home. It gradually followed that it was more desirable to live near a temple than a market, and greater merit ensued from conversing with priests than with tradesmen. These distinctions between something and the rest of things were all a ghastly mistake for which humanity was paid, and must continue to pay until it realizes that there is no difference between sacred and profane objects or pursuits other than a psychological one. Even this difference is an illusion that has no reality until thinking creates an unreal semblance of reality. The real separation lies not between the various tasks of life, but rather between the motives and methods by which these tasks are accomplished. All constructive and creative action is sacred, even as all constructive and creative action is sacred, even as all parts of the universe are equally the parts and members of God. The priest is no more sacred than the charwoman, and in heaven, as a state of reward, she may have the higher reward of the two. There can be no true spirit of sanctity apart from the well-directed industry and consecration to the fulfillment of responsibility. The holy man who considers asceticism a substitute for labor must sometime discover the error of his ways. When the priests of antiquity began selling salvation, the mystery temples were doomed, and today, where anything other than merit is accepted as a substitute for merit, disaster impends. Let us consider the experiments made by men in their efforts to escape from conditions which they have been unable to master. The religious community is an outstanding example. Pythagoras is regarded as the originator of the idea of people coming together, pooling their assets and sharing alike. Pythagoras met his death. Most of his disciples were murdered, and his school was burned by a disgruntled ex-member. All subsequent efforts of this nature have been true to the illustrious precedent. The difficulty is obvious. It is impossible to get away from your own self even momentarily. The story may run something like this. A group of proletarians who were not doing very well in the administration of their earthly affairs arrive at the conclusion that this failure is the result of over-spirituality. In other words, they cannot stand the low vibrations of their present environment, so they go off somewhere and work up a new set of vibrations indefinitely worse than those they attempted to escape from. There is no cesspool of human intrigue in the most congested areas of our delinquent civilization where more cruelty can be devised and executed than where a group of so-called spiritually enlightened persons start running a small universe of their own on some 100-acre tract. It does not matter greatly where people are. It is what they are that counts. The centuries of religious dishonesty behind us bring to each of us such a heritage of false notions that it is the most difficult thing to live down our theology and really find our religion. Analyzing the psychological reactions of motion picture fans, a writer once said that people attend the theaters in order to live vicariously under circumstances which they will never be able to actually realize in this life. The poor clerk, watching the society drama, is for a short time in a beautiful mansion with smartly dressed people, projecting himself into the intrigues of the envied rich. The nobody forgets that he is a nobody, and under the spell of the spinning celluloid is a person of great consequence. A certain type of religious thought produces an almost similar result. Listening to the smooth-tongued orations of some parlor adept, gullible folk forget the impotency of their present state and feel transcendental powers within their reach. They see themselves projecting their astral bodies and prying into each other's private lives, or, as one occultist once said, counting the eggs in some other man's basket. They imagine themselves transformed almost instantly into the very personification of wisdom. All sorrow and misfortune vanish. Peace, power, and plenty hang as a mirage in the air, and before the mist clears away, some very foolish things are usually done. In theory, we can be anything, but in practice, we are limited by our capabilities and the general level of our development. It is useless to renounce the world unless with it we renounce worldliness. Wisdom as a state is seldom the motive which inspires the average Occidental in occultism. Wisdom is too abstract. We do not know what the word means, nor do we know what the state of being wise actually is. The real goal for which most seek is in some way related to worldly affluence, and the powers developed are visualized as being used to provide our superiority in some test of temporal affairs. Take the community idea. Departing from the wickedness of our commercial system, 30 or 40 people make a great gesture of renouncing the world which in reality they are delighted to escape from. Dyed in worldliness, however, they have no more than formed the community than a battle of wits begins to determine who shall run it. And as a religious war is fought according to no rules, the biting and scratching continues until someone forecloses the mortgage on the property, and the pious are forced back into the delinquent society of which they never ceased ethically to be a part. The world needs holy men at the present time, but by the term we mean to imply persons sanctified to high purpose and consecrated unselfishly to the intelligent service of a suffering humanity. India views Mahatma Gandhi as such a holy man. There are thousands who would be glad to receive the recognition that Gandhi has gained, but there are few who would have the strength and courage to preserve as he in what he firmly regards as a high principle. His body battered with blows, several times left for dead, imprisoned for long periods, and constantly exposed to hardships which would daunt the courage of the physically fit. This little man has carried on through the selflessness of his purpose and the power born of absolute conviction. A Hindu scholar speaking of Mahatma Gandhi at a dinner given in honor of the birthday of India's great holy man said in opening, "Gandhi is a real Mahatma, a great soul who has found his work in this concrete world of suffering humanity." As we have said before, the world needs holy men, yes, and holy women. Not the kind that clench their hands until their fingernails grow through their palms, or who swear not to bathe until the millennium, nor again those who wear out rickety chairs, listening a life away and forgetting all they hear. No, not even those who feel called upon to found little groups of 6 or 8 persons and share some imaginary illumination with them. We need holy men and women to go out into life and spread the years equipping themselves to guide this country through the dark years which lie ahead, to assist in the establishment of higher standards of right and wrong, to amend unjust laws on our statute books, to become the patron of broader and nobler educational ideas, to foster the cause of world peace, to aid in the attainment of economic justice, and most of all, to provide the millions of this generation with a workable, livable philosophy of life. This modern era is philosophically bankrupt. There is nothing to bind society to the attainment of any end more exalted than personal selfishness. There is no vision inspiring our activity. We are a ship without a rudder, or, more correctly, without a helmsman. Yes, we need holy men. We need someone to take a firm grasp upon the great spinning wheel of the ship of state. We need a strong helmsman, with the spray dashing upon his face and waves of circumstance beating down upon him, will stand true and guide the erring multitudes into a safe haven. There is no time to get down on one's knees and pray. This is the time to get up on one's feet and work. The God of hosts marches with the working man, giving skill to his hammer and strength to his arm. There is no time for those who believe they see the light to go out into the desert and bite their nails over the sins of men. This is the time for those who have found in occultism and philosophy an inspiration to higher achievement to go forth into the world and work, bringing to society the strength which they have found themselves. I'm just mixing stuff up, aren't I? This is the time for those who have found in occultism and philosophy an inspiration to higher achievement, to go forth into the world and work, bringing to society the strength which they themselves have found. Only through the unselfish cooperation of each with all can the modern world be saved. Unless this end is accomplished, the fall of empire is inevitable. Only the wise can be unselfish. Only the illumined can cooperate. The time has come for them to rise from their beds of spikes and take their places as practical exponents of philosophy and ethics before a world which, like some tiny plant in a darkened corner, is fading away for lack of light and truth. Man, ain't it the truth?